Trade. We are live from Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya. Now, we all know about the rankings of Africa and its largest economies. Yeah, if you look at it as we stand right now at the moment, we're talking about Nigeria right at the top, South Africa, Egypt, depending, of course, on what the rand is doing. But we're trying to develop another kind of ranking here, and this looks at who is at the best of times facilitating intra-African trade. Now, if you look at that ranking, it upends the order pretty much as we know it. Right at the top, we've got South Africa, followed by Namibia, you'd be surprised. Nigeria is third. You have Zambia, and at number 5, you have got Cote d'Ivoire. Where is Kenya? You're asking the question. Well, that's part of the question we're going to try and answer here today. Let me introduce my guest. From my immediate left is Mr. Kiprono Kittony. He's the chairman of the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce. Say welcome.
Thank you.
Next to him is Amr Kamel, Executive Vice President, Business Development and Corporate Banking, Afreximbank. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And next to him is Rachel Muthoga. She's the Deputy CEO of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. And next to her is Mr. Jaswinder Bedi. He is the chairman of the Export Promotion Council. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Last but not least, Hazel Ojany, Commercialization and Investment Advisor within African Focus. Hazel, thank you for coming through.
Asante, and welcome to Kenya.
Asante sana, ma. Thank you for coming through as well. Let me begin with you, Amir, because I think you, as a bank, have a mandate to increase intra-African trade. We know the stats, they are boring. 15% versus north of 50% for most of the other regional geographies. And you have looked at this and said, there's something that is missing here. Let's talk about that part which is missing, in particular the focus of information. How can we not know about Africa when we're Africans?
Well, let me start by again saying good morning to everybody and thank the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the Export Promotion Council of Kenya for facilitating this event, which is a very important event because, like you rightly mentioned, it's very unfortunate that intra-African trade is at such a low level when we compare to other regions, that are much higher levels, and the importance of, as my colleague was presenting, of making sure that we improve on that. There are quite a number of problems, obviously, that are hampering intra-African trade. Some of them have been attributed to infrastructure, and again, my colleague, I think, has explained that, yes, definitely infrastructure is a problem, but it's not the main problem. In our view, and based on some of the studies we've done, trade information is a critical problem. And the whole idea of trying or doing that intra-African trade fair is to try and bridge that gap. Now, we've had the fantastic landmark event that happened earlier in March of the CFTA agreement being signed. So clearly, governments, the political will, have shown their political will. They have the intention of actually, creating the necessary enabling environment for that. It's now up to institutions like ourselves and the private sector to now work hand in hand to make sure that that dream becomes a reality.
Right.
And the intra-African trade fair is one of those means of reaching that.
Yeah. So when you say that information is missing and we don't know enough about each other, what exactly do you mean? Because I know, for instance, that Kenya is the biggest economy in East Africa. Correct. But you are saying that is not enough.
No, I'm saying yes, definitely that's not enough, because Kenya is a very good case. It's the biggest economy in East Africa. It's trading relatively well with this EAC region, so sub-region basically. But when you compare that now to the whole region, then it still falls considerably low. And unfortunately, there's been a trend of sort of decline in the level of trade. Yeah. While it is, in my view, Kenya is very well positioned to be one of the top countries in terms of intra-African trade. Yeah. It has very good infrastructure. It has a relatively well-developed manufacturing and can take advantage of that. It can start consider sourcing many of its raw materials from within Africa and then go into to produce it, go into agro-processing and things like that, and then export into Africa as well. So I think Kenya is a very good example of a country that has potential to go way up the scale in terms of intra-African trade.
100%. I'm going to pose my next question to Jaswinder because Your business is to make sure that Kenya is exporting as much as you can. I suppose you are exporting. The question is to who? But the question I really want to put to you is a ranking of number 11 for Kenya in Africa in terms of intra-African trade. I was surprised by the number. Is that a number that surprises you?
Well, I agree that, well, for Kenya, and we export $6 billion of goods out of Kenya and import 17 billion. To me, I'm very unhappy with the disconnect of 11 billion. And my mandate is to increase that 6 billion and bring it close to 17 billion so that we have a zero-sum game. At the EPC, we have a clear mandate. In that clear mandate, we want to grow exports 15% per annum year on year. And by 2030, which is our vision 2030, we won't have a zero-sum game. We've done the multiples and the scenario analysis and looked at which areas are we going to grow with.
Precisely.
And we've seen, number one, export today is tea, 1.2 billion. But 97% of the tea is exported in raw form. Now, if we can add value on that tea and ship it out, that number moves to 7.5 billion. So straight away, it's a game changer. Similarly, on other value streams that we're looking at selling value-added product. Coffee is another example. Coffee, believe it or not, today is our number 5 export. It used to be a number 3 export. And that's declining in numbers. And again, we're still doing more of the same and expecting different results. We really need to add value on our coffee as well, brand it. And I think the government is very clear that we need to be looking at value streams, adding value, making sure we capture that value and bring it back to the continent and bring it back to Kenya. And I guess the same applies for the rest of the continent. We are still primary producers of raw material and very little value addition, and we really don't get that value back to the continent. Look at cotton, for example. I'll give you an example of Uganda. They export $50 million of cotton.
Yeah.
And if they make a simple T-shirt, they'll start making $750 million. So it becomes a game changer.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, when I look for my Kenya tea in Johannesburg, I can't find it. I look for the coffee, I can't find it. I had run out of coffee recently. Until I passed through Addis, I had not been able to find my coffee, which is a problem. I want to know where you are targeting those exports that you are saying you are going to grow 15% per annum in the next few years.
Well, we, as a country, are looking at where do we have competitive and comparative advantage. Of course, we have competitive and comparative advantage where we have duty-free market access. As a country, we're stated as a developing country. So we really don't have the world at our oyster, at our doorstep. We have the US market under AGOA, and we have that market access up to 2025. We have the European Union, which is a huge market opportunity.
Yeah.
We were a little worried with Brexit and what will happen with the UK, but we've been told with the recent visit of the Prime Minister that Kenya's exports will not be affected.
They still need to drink tea.
And we're looking at COMESA, ESC, and of course the CFTA. So wherever we have competitive and comparative advantage, we want to focus on that.
Yeah.
We don't think that we should be swimming upstream
Yeah.
and trying to compete, because we need to work on our competitiveness as we go to the other regions.
Yeah.
But what is at our doorstep, we need to expand. And I'll give you an example. We're the largest exporter of apparel from the region to the United States. Our exports last year were $370 million. That is 0.3% of the US pie.
Sure.
The US imports $100 billion. We are duty-free, and we are doing 0.37 and chest thumping. We're doing a great job. We're not. Yes, compared to the rest of Africa, we are.
Yeah.
But compared to Bangladesh, they export 30 billion to the world, and we do 0.37%, 370 million, and we have duty-free market access, and they don't. So there's something that we're doing wrong, not to capture a bigger slice of pie.
Yeah.
So the pie for the US under AGOA is 100 billion in one value chain, the apparel space. What are we going to do? So we have a focused agenda there. By 2022, we want to hit $2 billion.
Sure.
By 2020, $1 billion. So we need to be looking at it very differently, looking at market spaces, and then focused intervention.
Yeah.
So as EPC, what we did is, as I became chair, we decided that we go to our constituents. We go to our exporters.
Yeah.
So we went to KEPSA, KAM, Floriculture, FPIC, all the institutions, including individual corporates who are exporting, and said to them, guys, give us your pain.
Sure.
Where are your pain areas? Why can't you grow exports? Why are we stagnant? And we got about 15 verticals that came out on the issues of doing business and the issues that our impending export trade.
I'm going to come back and ask you to give us that detail, because I wanted to get from a Kenya Private Sector Alliance perspective as an umbrella body what the issue is. Why are you unable to satisfy his demands and enable him to be able to export as much as you can? From your perspective, Rachel, before I come to Kiprono.
Okay, thank you very much. And in engaging with our members who are members of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, a large part of it comes back to access to information. Why? Because the markets that we know, he's referencing America. Yeah. It's very clear, there's a clear pipeline, you know which are the goods that I have opportunities to export there. But if for most businesses, if they think about Cote d'Ivoire, then they can't quite clearly see what their opportunities are there, because the rest has been researched, it's well written, and they're actually getting approaches saying, come this way.
Should we blame colonialism, do you think?
Let's just say other people have done the homework, we also need to do our homework. And so really for us as Kenya Private Sector Alliance is to look at how do we get our members to have this information. Our role and our responsibility is also to look at how do we build relationships between businesses. A large part of what we are trying to engage in is getting Kenyan businesses to speak to businesses in these other African countries.
Right.
Getting them to engage and be able to say, even if we might not have detailed research that we can use, what do you think as a business we can trade on? What do you think as a business you can be able to help me to do back and forth?
Right.
And really we find that that's one of the ways that we can infuse our energy into this space.
Is that difficult? Is language an issue on that perspective? Is culture an issue?
To some extent, I would say those are challenges, largely because different markets or different countries have different ways that they organize as business. In Kenya, we have a clear strategy, we have the Private Sector Alliance, but we also have strong business member organizations who also are really, they're the ones who are the strength behind what we do as the apex body. Yeah. If we didn't have a strong Kenya Association of Manufacturers, if we didn't have a strong Chamber of Commerce, then we would not be effective as an apex body. Now, other countries haven't really organized as business in the same way.
Right.
And so really even just getting a chance to engage.
Right.
And for us, really what we're doing is to be able to tell the Kenyan experience that us working together, being able to all speak about our different pains in different industries, but to speak together has helped us.
I'll come back and talk about another issue. We were talking about it off stage before we came onto the program. And this has to do with the fact that even as Africans, we find ourselves with divisions that necessarily should not be there. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Kiprono, from your perspective, from the Chamber of Commerce perspective, please share your pain. Why can't you export as much as you can? Of course, you service your local market, but you also want the dollars, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. And you asked the question, should we blame colonialism? And I think we must blame colonialism.
For sure.
We must, because if we look at the way the continent of Africa is constructed, it was constructed in a fashion that was actually to facilitate the export of raw materials to Western markets. And I cannot for the life of me explain why we, for example, don't have a vessel plying Lagos to Mombasa. It is easier, and we know that for a fact, to import a container from Southampton in the United Kingdom than it is from Lagos to Nairobi, to Mombasa.
That's true.
So we have serious and fundamental infrastructural obstacles in the way of trade. But in the case of Kenya, I think we must also recognize that the primary exports that Kenya has are perhaps not attuned to the African market. I mean, we do a lot of flour exports, coffee and tea, but I'm confident that the positioning of Kenya in terms of export and facilitating intra-African trade will improve with time.
Are you saying Africans don't buy flowers, they don't drink coffee?
I mean, I think in the list of priorities, it doesn't fall very high. But with increasing
I shall buy more flowers, I can tell you.
Yes, and coffee and tea. I mean, coffee is a culture that is today, a revolution almost globally. I'm a coffee grower.
Originating from Africa,
Originating from Africa, in
really
Kaffa, in Ethiopia. Yes. One of the things, I also serve as the vice chair of the World Chamber Federation of the International Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah.
A role that of necessity requires that I fly to many African countries. And one of the things that I have done as a habit is always to visit supermarkets wherever I travel. And, it's amazing to see the sort of commodities that you find on the shelves of supermarkets in Africa. In Nigeria, for example, in Lagos, I found butter all the way from New Zealand. And one of the countries that really surprised me was Zimbabwe, where despite all the challenges they've faced for a very long period of time, you would find that the majority of the products on their shelves are homegrown Zimbabwean products, of course with a share from South Africa. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I found that the chickens are imported from Brazil. So there's a lot of opportunity, and I think if we look at the deployment of infrastructure that is taking place today in the continent,
Yeah.
there will certainly be a big upside to it.
Yeah, I want to talk about a little bit about the lack of information that Amir was talking about, and to what extent you think that hinders the ability of your members to be able to supply, say, butter from Kenya to Zimbabwe, as you say, or perhaps to Nigeria, or even to Egypt.
Certainly, it plays a big role. I mean, there's a huge gap in information. Information asymmetry is one of the major obstacles to trade, as are non-tariff barriers. But I would say that the event that took place in Kigali a few months ago with the 44 heads of state signing on to the CCFTA was an important step forward. But I think what is important for us as African people to realize is that that was an event.
Sure.
And the real challenge is in the process. I mean, how are we going to actualize this? How are we going to eradicate the non-tariff barriers to create a seamless market for the free flow of goods and services?
Yeah, but often we're told that business is way ahead of the politicians, so I'm not going to let you go on that. I'm going to come back to you. Hazel, if I can come to you. I've made you listen to all of this because you sit outside and you watch these people and then you help them make decisions in respect of where to invest that money. When you listen to the conversation around the lack of information, is it a genuine reason for why people are not trading? Infrastructure, we shall take that aside and talk about it a little later, but let's just talk about the information aspect.
Information is key, and also how we package the information. When we look at our data and how we analyze and review our data, it's very important to make it realistic for the businessman on the ground. And the businessman on the ground, we tend to forget that the informal sector controls our GDP. And we focus more for our peers who are on the table here. Yet the GDP of most African countries are controlled by the informal sector. So do we even converse with them? Do we listen to them? Do we address the aspects that challenge their ability to grow and reinvent themselves? Specific to Kenya, I feel we're still doing the same things we were doing during our colonial times. It's time to move forward. The same tourism package that we did in the 60s is what you're doing today. The same products of how your tea is packaged in the 60s is what we're doing today. So how are we presenting ourselves?
Yeah.
Kenya needs to also start reviewing its PR. We are reactive. When something goes wrong is when we go and have our PR events.
Right.
We need to start controlling the press.
Now you're talking to me. What?
We need to control how the message is displayed. There's more violent crime in the US than there is in Kenya when we have a travel advisory. But you don't see that. In my opinion, and it'll be good to hear others' thoughts, in my opinion, I think it's only South Africa that really controls how messages are depicted of their country. And the rest of us are responsive when something has happened on the ground.
Yeah, I froze a little bit when you said most of our economies are controlled by the informal sector, or dominated, I think this is what you wanted to say, dominated by the informal sector. I think it speaks to what you was talking about, where you live here as the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, and you go to, shall we say, Burundi, and you can't find an equivalent body, and therefore you can't find people that you trade with. So where do we go from there? Is it a case of perhaps Afreximbank working with some of these countries to try to help them formalize some of these businesses? I mean, I'm fumbling here. Who can help me out? Yeah?
I could chip in because recognizing that, the fact that the small businesses have such an important role to play in our economy.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're having...
But can they export?
Yes, they can. Because we can aggregate, we can assist them to aggregate, because they, as a small individual company, might not be able to make the volumes that they can have one individual relationship with a supplier that they need to supply to. But assisting them to, one, associate, so building associations of small businesses that are then able to then say, we can aggregate our product and be able to ensure that it's all standardized and then be able to export that. That's a lot of the thinking that's happening now, as we look at the SME sector, and also looking at what are the challenges that small and medium enterprises are facing, and how can we better the environment for them. So looking at the SME index that was set up by UNESCO, and being able to look at what does that mean in Kenya, or what does that mean in individual African countries, so that we focus on them as a strong part of the economy, and not just on the big businesses because they pay a lot of taxes.
Yeah, you want to come in?
Can I?
Yes, I just want to say that we also need to be cognizant, and I want to emphasize the point that I had raised earlier, that it is a process as opposed to an event. You see, there are there's also the role of the regional trading blocs, which is a collective of nations. Then there are the nations. And behind each nation, there's a bureaucracy.
Yes.
And behind the bureaucracy, there are business communities.
Yes.
So as a business practitioner, as a businessman from Kenya wanting to access the market, say in DR Congo, and I commend the EPC for really leading the foray to try and find market opportunities for Kenyan business people in this region, the business practitioner has to plow through the bureaucracy of the country, which is dictated by what the regional bloc's position is.
Sure.
So I think we need to recognize...
Are you suggesting the regional blocks may actually be a hindrance rather than a facilitator?
I think that they need to catch up with the spirit of the leaders who signed on to the protocol in Kigali. And I'll give an example. Our president is absolutely focused, President Kenyatta is absolutely focused on the agenda of intra-African trade. And when we went to Nigeria, Abuja, with him, one of the things that was done was to sign a special status agreement to give Kenyan goods market access in Nigeria,
right,
and vice versa. But then that had to be ratified by ECOWAS, a process that is still incomplete. So
when was that?
Much as I would love
when was that?
for Kenyan butter to find its place onto the shelves in Nigerian supermarkets,
yeah,
there is still that ratification from
needs to
the
be done.
trading bloc.
When was that?
Maybe 3 years ago.
Oh, goodness me.
Yes.
There we go. This is what we're talking about. Now, these guys have touched on two aspects that we need to focus on. One is the infrastructure side. Let's park that aside a little bit. Let's talk a little bit more about one of the things that they raised, which is what we've talked about, the information. But the other thing that she raised is around the quality of the goods that are able to cross borders and therefore be able to be accepted in Egypt, in South Africa, in Namibia, without quibbling, or even in the US or in the UK.
Okay, but let me first go into the issue of the informal sector and how we can improve that and things like that. I think one key issue there is technology, right? And we've seen, and Kenya here is the the birthplace for M-Pesa, the pioneer in payment technologies and things like that through the telecommunications. So
Savannah Valley, right?
Exactly, and that, I think, in my view, obviously had a tremendous impact in terms of getting into the informal sector, into the banking sort of sphere. So I think it's technologies like this that we could try and use to try and get some of those informal trade into the thing. At Afreximbank, for example, we're also now doing a payments and settlements platform, regional payments and settlements platform, which will hopefully also considerably reduce the foreign currency component in the trade. Because if you have two countries trading amongst each other, say $500 million worth of goods go back and forth, but the net amount that is due may be 50 million or something, right, in foreign currency, that will be settled in foreign currency.
Right.
So I think, again, Kenya has a lot to
How will that work? Actually, maybe it's an opportunity for you to explain it.
Basically, it's to allow different countries to trade amongst each other. Okay, we will be having the operating that payment platform. Okay. Sometimes relying on some of the regional platforms that are already there, and then we will be doing the settlement. So it's the net amount that is paid to the country that has the surplus. Okay. The net amount of foreign currency.
It's at the country level.
Yes, yes. The net amount in foreign currency. The rest basically will be settled in the local currency of the different parties. So I think that's a critical element, and we were hoping that going after that, we will now even incorporate it to become a marketplace where it'll include sort of logistics and things that will be attached to those payments, so that moved goods and services can be moved instead of somebody carrying a small bag and, and crossing the border to sell it and coming back with cash and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Let's talk quality. Let's talk certification. Ensuring that that product that leaves Kenyan shores is actually able to be bought when it reaches South Africa or when it reaches New Zealand.
Right. I think the issue of quality is not just for intra-African trade problem. I think that's the general problem in Africa, where many exporters find that their products end up rejected at the destination because they haven't met the sort of the specifications and the quality that is required, and that is because of the lack of good testing and certification centers. So again, one of the initiatives we are championing is creating an internationally accredited testing, certification, and this center that will basically do that kind of thing before things happen. Yeah. So we're starting off with doing that in Nigeria. It's already very advanced.
It's already been rolled out.
Yeah, it's already advanced. No, it hasn't started yet, but it's already at very advanced stage.
Okay.
And then after it kicks off, we'll now replicate it in other countries.
I guess the people in the room want to know when it's coming here.
Yeah, well, let us test it there and have it succeed, and then definitely we can replicate it, the model in other countries, especially in countries like Kenya.
Jaswinder, from your perspective, to what extent is that a big issue when you take or when you promote Kenyan products to other parts of the world?
Well, I can give you an East African example.
Yeah.
The standards that the Kenya Bureau of Standards have got, and say the Uganda Bureau of Standards or the Tanzania Bureau of Standards, we are respecting each other's standards, and we are harmonizing those standards so that we have one standard. Because standards are subjective. What is quality to you might not be quality to me. And I think that's really where we need to go. Yes, we can look at best practices globally, but more or less, we need to harmonize how we look at things. We need to look at that glass as half full, all of us, and not somebody saying it's half empty. Because if he's saying it's half empty and you're saying it's half full, you're both right.
Are you calling for patriotism in our buying patterns?
No, I'm saying that we need to make sure that we look at it from the same set of glasses and harmonize those standards and agree and respect. Because fundamentally, if there is no respect in that relationship is going nowhere.
But that's going to be hard, isn't it?
And so can I just add to that, because that's a very good point.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think was not mentioned about the trade fair, that there's going to be a workshop on harmonization of standards and championed by the African Union. So there's basically going to be quite a bit of a debate on that and seeing how we do exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, because I was going to say that it's going to be very difficult, that harmonization process, because as you say, what might look good to me might not look good to the next chap. And we know politics comes into play. And now I want to raise with you the issue of petty nationalism that we see sometimes dominating our ability to trade between the continents. I've listened to many conversations where you hear people say, and I'm not mentioning names, if a certain company comes from a certain part of Africa and it goes to a certain part of Africa, what you often hear is that, well, they think they are not African. And I think I can label that accusation at the north, and I can label that accusation at the south. To what extent is this kind of nationalism hindering your ability as a Kenyan promotion agency to get your product into South Africa, for instance?
Well, what's hindering us today is tariff. I mean, we're not part of SADC. Kenya is part of...
But you're part of COMESA.
We're part of COMESA.
And AFCTA.
And we are part of AFCTA. So we are hoping that we can dismantle this tariff borders that we have. So, for example, you are an ESC country and you're Tanzania. Your goods make it to South Africa duty-free. And a Kenyan company, which is also part of ESC, or a Ugandan company, does not make it. So I'm actually happy that the CFTA will break those walls, because how do you classify Kenya at the same tariff rate as China or India into South Africa? And yet we call ourselves Africa? Surely there should be some preferential tariff for the continent of Africa whilst we operationalize the CFTA. But you can't classify Kenyan goods, Indian goods, Chinese goods at the same tariff.
Yeah. So when I was in Nigeria, one of the things I raised was the fact that, we're talking about intra-African trade and the creation of these African champions, and yet you've got Nigeria, Africa's biggest economy, not inside the AFCTA. However, I can't say that about Kenya, because Kenya was the first country to ratify, right? Have we seen, thank you. Have we seen tangible benefits?
I think it's early days. It's early days, and let me...
Why is it early? I mean, we are late already, as it is. We are at 15%.
I want to emphasize again the point that it's a process, but then we need to fast forward the process as much as we can. But I want to say that on the question of petty nationalism, this thing has actually gone full cycle. Because if you look at the founding fathers of most of the nations in Africa today, they were serious Pan-Africanists. In Ghana, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in South Africa, they all had a Pan-African vision for one Africa with one seamless market, with one people. And then it went into a realm where people became extremely nationalistic, focused on what happens within their territorial boundaries. Then we went now into regional blocks. Then from the regional blocks, we had, for example, the tripartite, which brings together two or three, I think 3 regional blocks, which has then been overtaken now by the CCFTA. But then the question is, in each of these steps that we have taken, have we actualized the aspiration of the initiators? And I think for me, the greater challenge is really for the bureaucracies to match the will of the political leaders who signed on to that agreement.
Yeah, and I must say, when you say the founding fathers of Africa, I had a little thing at the back of my mind. Don't doubt me. I am a child of African Pan-Africanism, born 1963, and therefore I've been around and seen African politics. But those borders, by the way, were not created by us.
Yes.
They were created in Berlin in 1884. And therefore, when we defend and we stand up and we say, oh, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, actually, you're championing what Europe decided for us in 1884. And we should be breaking it down.
Absolutely. And I support the breaking down, and I think it should be fast-forwarded, and we need to really have a lot more people-to-people engagement. We need to actually look at what it is that hinders the flow of goods and services.
One of those is infrastructure. Let's talk about infrastructure. Do you want to address that first before we open it up?
But just before we go to infrastructure.
Please, come in.
Out of the 44 heads of state that signed the CFTA on the 21st of March, I think the agreement was ratification we done ASAP, and as soon as 22 countries have ratified, we start the business.
At the last count?
And Kenya and Ghana were one of the first countries who ratified. And I met the Ghanaian minister in Washington about 6 weeks ago, and I said to him, Alan is a good friend of mine, he also worked at the AUC. I said, Alan, why can't Kenya and Ghana do it alone? Why can't we just start this business under CFTA in a bilateral agreement and let everybody else come to the party? Because how do we wait for 22 member states? And if you look at the TFTA that Kiprono talked about, that was signed 2015, where in 2018, the ratification of most of these countries had not happened. And those are 3 regions, EAC, SADC, and COMESA.
Sure.
So if we took 3 years and we haven't done a single transaction at TFTA, how many years are we going to wait for the CFTA? So I think some bold steps need to be taken. And by 2 or 3 or 4 countries, you just need to lead it.
Yeah.
And for Ghana, which is not part of East Africa or the TFTA, part of ECOWAS, and we need 2 big blocks just dismantling these whole walls and say, guys, we want to do business. And we are here for business, and we are open for business.
Would I be correct in understanding that actually there's no business that's been facilitated under IFCTA to date?
Correct.
Because ratification hasn't happened in the required numbers.
Absolutely.
Political will? Doesn't look like it's happening, right?
No, political will, if 44 heads of state have signed.
Yeah, but they have not gone back to their parliaments and gotten them to ratify.
Well, I think they have their processes, but we need to fast-track the process. That's my point.
We do need to fast-track the process. Let's talk infrastructure.
Yeah.
Or do you want to weigh in on the political debate?
No.
Let's talk infrastructure. The point has been made about infrastructure is that our infrastructure is incapable or does not facilitate intra-African trade. And yet you guys have done studies that show that actually there's capacity for what? $200 billion?
Well, $1 trillion basically worth of trade that is happening in Africa. You mean the trade, level of trade?
Yeah.
The infrastructure is carrying, I mean, currently? Africa's trade is around $1 trillion, right? That means that they're able to, the infrastructure that they have is able to support that. Sure. But I think the problem is that much of that infrastructure also is to the rest of the world, right?
Right.
The problem is
designed
the internal
by the colonialists to take stuff out of
It is the internal infrastructure now that we have to address. And obviously that is, I mean, it's very evident, for example, if you want to fly from one country to the other, you may have to go through Europe or through, wherever to reach there. So clearly there is a gap. There's no doubt about that. And I think we need to rely very heavily on technology and innovation to try and bridge that gap, because currently the African Development Bank has estimated the financing gap, for example, for infrastructure at around $90 billion a year or something from now until 2025. So that's a huge gap. So there's no way we're going to be able to fill it by just financing. We have to find other smart ways of dealing with it, on the logistics side, creating sort of export trading companies that, things that will facilitate that kind of a thing without too much expenses.
But Amir, that money is there. We all know that money is there. Should we talk about the $500 billion of African foreign exchange reserves that are sitting where? In the US, in Europe, earning what? 1%, 2%, or 3%?
Absolutely.
When it should be working in Africa where your returns are much higher? So again, I think it comes back to the issue of political will. So how do we use the infrastructure that we have? Is that an issue for you, Jaswinder, the infrastructure?
It's a big issue. I give you my own example. I wanted to buy fair trade cotton from Mali, and I was told it's going to take 90 days for it to come to Mombasa because he has to go via Singapore. I mean, the logistical disconnect is the single biggest hindrance to trade in Africa. And we talk about these big projects. We've talked about Cape to Cairo for many years. I mean, I think, if I remember right, 20, 30 years we've been talking about that corridor. And it is built partly and it is not built partly.
I forgot about even the railway line that John Rose was talking about.
And we're now talking about Lamu to Yonda in Cameroon, but Are we just becoming talk shops?
Sure.
Or are we really going to build that infrastructure to connect the continent of
Yeah.
Africa? Because if we connect the continent, trade will happen. If you don't connect it, it's not going to happen.
Okay, so let's use technology.
Sorry, let me just comment
Yeah.
on that. In my opinion, we don't look at the low-hanging fruits. So for example, 1 in 3 passengers who are flying in Africa going for health services goes through the Kenya hub. 1 in 3, right? You're either doing your transit in Kenya through Nairobi or you're doing your transit in Ethiopia through Addis. The question we should be asking the healthcare sector is why isn't Kenya a hub for healthcare? And based on, our strengths as a location, is it time to open our medical sector to talent? I shouldn't have to fly out to gain talent. Our presidents should not have to fly out of Africa to gain talent. They should be flying into Kenya.
I agree. And I have to apologize. Please. I have to apologize because we did advertise that we're going to have Mr. Mikos from Kenya Airways. Unfortunately, he had another meeting that he was called into suddenly and he was unable to come. Because one of the questions we're going to put to him was exactly what you're talking about. Because I experienced it last week. We were in Abidjan. And to get to Abidjan, we had to go through Addis and then get to Abidjan. But I'll tell you what happened. I met 2 Nigerian fellows. They came from Lagos to come to Abidjan, a flight of less than an hour. We came from Joburg, a flight of 6 hours, but if you go through the various stops we did, 19 hours. They paid $90 less than we paid to fly from Johannesburg to go to Abidjan. They were flying for an hour. We flew for 19 hours, or 6 hours if you flew direct. It's incredible the cost of flying around Africa and how that hinders, I believe, the issue of intra-African trade as well. Because costs are a big part of the problem, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I want some of you to address this before we open up the debate to the floor. Where are you seeing those big cost humps when you export? You would know. You would know. You also can speak about that. Who wants to take it first?
Well, talk about costs. If you look at East Africa and
hidden and unhidden.
The heads of state have severally said that we want an open skies policy. And we want to bring the cost of connectivity within East Africa, which is 5 member states, now 6, down. But if you go to Uganda, you're actually paying $350. And with $390...
How many minutes in the air?
50 minutes. You can take a 5-hour flight to Dubai at $399 or $499, or to India for that matter. So the point I'm making is that you're absolutely right that maybe the private sector is also to blame, and maybe profiteering is also to blame, that you don't want...
Maybe competition is to blame?
Well, maybe competition as well, but largely if you open the skies and you have no individual taxes between those, because if you talk to private sector, if Sebastian was here, he would have said, out of the $350 air ticket, 200 the governments are taking. I'm only getting 150.
That's true.
So they will hide behind that, but is that really true? I know for a fact that on telecom, in the Northern Corridor, they agreed that they would be dismantling roaming charges within East Africa. And there was a date put on it. That date was last year, 1st of
I remember.
July or
I
something.
covered that story.
We have 12 months on, and we are still roaming between Uganda and Kenya and Rwanda. And yet, so are we really committed when we give ourselves a date that we will dismantle roaming charges? In Europe, they've done it. But telecom companies only make money in roaming. They don't make money on local calls. So maybe the private sector of those telecom companies are holding it back.
Yeah.
And then there are lobby groups behind who are counterproductive.
Yeah.
Because as productive as the government and the political will
Sure.
is that we want to dismantle these barriers,
Yeah.
but maybe profit, that big word, is actually holding us back.
She's right there.
And I've just been accused, right?
Defend
I
yourself.
think there's definitely a big picture view that both private sector and governments have to take. To recognize that this extra profit that I'm making from this single transaction is not necessarily going to help me if I was to step back and be able to achieve a much bigger, wider audience, and therefore be able to make, it's a simple business, just move numbers as opposed to trying to aim for profits from one transaction. But I think there's this unhappy, dysfunctional relationship between the bureaucracies and also what the private sector would like to do, or even what it's doing. If you think about one of the other costs that makes logistics and infrastructure such an expense,
Yeah.
is also efficiency. And when we say efficiency, we must recognize that we are speaking both to government and also
Yes.
to ourselves as private sector. Because a lot of what then just would be looking at is, it's not just how much it costs, is that it took 90 days.
Yeah.
So what is the efficiency of that? And so looking at how do we not only just say we've built bridges, we've got ports, we've got airlines, but how efficient are they?
Yeah.
And is it the type of infrastructure? Is the system that is built onto the infrastructure efficient to ensure that I actually get the services that I should benefit from?
Sure.
So thinking about how efficient is our airport, how efficient is JKIA as a hub, because they're a regional hub, but beyond saying KQ should charge us this, is what is your customer experience as someone who's coming through JKIA? Thinking about our port in Mombasa, KEPSA is part of the Mombasa Port Charter community.
Yeah.
And we really are trying to engage to say we must ensure that even if we've got how many bats that are working,
Yeah.
we have to make sure that the system actually works
Yeah.
and is efficient, because that's the only way that business will actually venture into
Yeah.
a lot of this export.
I
that
can
we
tell
ask.
you that it took me about 15 minutes, and I think about 5 minutes of that was because we had to fill in the paperwork in this day and age of digital stuff.
Yeah.
Just say.
I want to say three things. The first one is, for me, what is absolutely crucial is that we need a paradigm shift. We need to look inwards at our markets in Africa and say, what is it that we can do to make these, to create the seamlessness in terms of the flow of goods and services. And I think historically, we've always looked out at markets and said, where are the opportunities? And, by and large, especially as speaking as a Kenyan, we've always looked at the West as a potential for your export markets. And when I look at the figures, and I was a bit elated to see that the intra-African trade figures actually gone to 15 from 12. I wonder how accurate those figures are, because you see Kenya, for example, in the next 5 years has its 4 big agenda items. And in that agenda, there is affordable universal healthcare. I know for a fact, of course, there's a lot to be said about the improvement of healthcare services in Kenya, but I know that regionally, Kenya is still the hub we're still exporting a lot of medical services. A lot of people from Rwanda, from Burundi are in hospitals in Nairobi enjoying our service, and that constitutes an export. And I wonder if that export actually makes its way into the figures. The second thing I want to say is about infrastructure. Infrastructure is a long game. And in infrastructure, many times we forget about internet, the internet connectivity. Sure. We forget about the contribution that can be made by the Internet of Things, by blockchaining, by artificial intelligence. And Kenya, again, is at the forefront of that. Safaricom is the first company to launch an AI platform called Jitambulishe. We are doing a lot on blockchaining. We're the first country to have a blockchain advisory council in the government. The private sector here is very active in seeing how we can blockchain our Ministry of Lands, work in collaboration with government. So some of these things can actually leapfrog us in terms of being able to improve the way we deliver our services and improve on efficiencies. And I think I concur with my sister's point here that really it is the efficiencies of the infrastructure we have that is perhaps a very major hindrance. And the third thing, and I want to emphasize this point again, is the bureaucracies. Yeah. The bureaucracies need to keep up.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone in the room knows what happens to the forms we fill in when we get to the airport, but we'll just leave that one hanging on. Okay. At this point, I'd like to open the debate to you, ladies and gentlemen. As we said, if we can raise your hand up and you identify who you are, and the microphone will come to you, and we can take as many questions as we can. Where are those microphones? There are hands around here. If we can get them quickly to the ladies and gentlemen that are up at the front. Yeah, they are making their way. Okay, is this part of the efficiency that we're talking about? Maybe a little bit. Okay, he's running. Okay? Ma'am, go ahead.
My name is Dorothy Gidai. I run a company called 360 Degrees International, working closely with African Union to promote and engage women and youth entrepreneurs, capacity building them, digital marketing skills, and trade. And now we're focusing on inter-Africa trade. Challenge to you and the panel. I haven't heard anyone talk about SMEs and how they can really drive the inter-Africa trade, because there's volume in the numbers of women, children, and youth. The African demographic dividend, which Jaswinder Bedi talked about earlier, and really great statistics you've shared there. And this is critical, because as much as we're building bigger industry, it's important that we focus on SMEs understanding what is CFTA, what is the Inter-Africa Trade Fair, how are we driving the intra-Africa trade, and how can they participate in inter-Africa trade. Asante sana.
Thank you very much. I think I did try to raise it, and there was partly an answer. Do you want to take it up again?
I can.
Yeah, okay. So let's take a couple more questions. and then we can get the answers. Okay? Let's get a hand here.
Good morning. My name is Samuel Wanjao. I represent a company called Legibra Limited. We're a technology company that facilitates a lot of e-commerce, trade, or rather by building platforms and mobile apps. So part of the discussion, and I'm happy that the panel has touched on it, is on application of technology. However, there's a challenge that I've found within our 10 years of operations, is that most of our manufacturers tend to shun technology because they are more into the let me call it, for lack of a better word, old school way of conducting trade. So I'd just like to read something that I found from this discussion, is that e-commerce sales worldwide amount to $2.3 trillion in 2017, and revenues are projected to be more than double to nearly $5 trillion by 2021. Now that market actually has been taken by American companies such as Amazon. However, we do not have a platform, or rather even the goodwill from both private and public sector, to have some one-stop shop for Africa products. So I just wanted to know what the panelists think about that.
Yeah, we are unicorns. Let's take another question. There's a hand here.
Good morning.
Thank you.
My name is Ernest. I'm a small private player in Kenya, business. I run a bit of a funny business, that's beekeeping and honey production. I have a very interesting concern and a question. Listening to what everybody's saying here today, I don't have a problem with communication in my business. I don't have a big problem with infrastructure. I do not have any problem with quality. And I think in Kenya, I think we have upped our quality game quite high. I have one single problem. I have a problem with a major competitor, which is China. China is killing our business in Kenya. Now, I don't know what is the solution, because normally on a business point of view, a competitor is tackled by either price or quality. I have a problem with price. I don't have a problem with quality. I have a problem with price. I cannot beat China on price. I cannot export any equipment or any product to any African country because I cannot compete with China prices.
Have you worked out why you are unable to compete on price?
I guess it's cost of production, because my cost of production is too high. I'd like to know, and I'd like to say here, maybe what we're lacking is government will, a government intervention in this to try and sort out how we curb this, or we can control this competitor, China.
Okay, thank you. If I can ask you, when you're answering, please to be as tight as you can be, okay?
All right.
You want?
Thank you. I'll try to attempt all three of them. I think a very relevant question about the SME linkages that my sister talked about. I think as Kenya Association of Manufacturers, we actually have an industrial linkage program, and we create mentor-mentee relationships, and we look at the SMEs as the mentees and the big boys in KAM as mentors. We've had a past where KAM was branded as the big boys club, big, large manufacturers. I mean, I personally addressed 40 designers about 2 months ago and took them to the world stage over the weekend when we had a fashion show in the Nairobi National Park, and actually showcased these young designers that you can sell on the world stage. So there's a very relevant point. In Kenya, we are deliberately doing this, and even the membership fee for the SME at KAM is very limited, and I know the same applies with KEPSA. We're actually encouraging the SMS, micro enterprise, to actually become members at a very nominal fee, so we can handhold you and take you to that world stage.
Okay.
Coming to the question on technology, I totally agree that the space of e-commerce is rapidly moving. In fact, retailing is going to become history. And I repeat, retailing will become history and will be taken over by e-tailing. And e-tailing is the space to be. We are seeing the big malls in America shutting down. They're all becoming recreational centers. And it's only a matter of time, and your world's biggest retailer is Amazon and Alibaba. And that's where the space is going. And I don't think Kenya is far away. We are moving into the space a bit slowly because the infrastructure to retail is not there. In California, you can buy a shirt, and in 1 hour, a drone will deliver it to your doorstep. So we need to look at that type of infrastructure, of speed to deliver, and not speed to take the order. We have platforms taking orders, but we have an infrastructure problem again on delivery, which will be resolved.
Okay.
My friend here talked about China.
Yeah.
And the competition from China. I don't disagree. China is a player that we need to reckon with, but there are costs that are rising in China. And what China is doing is to mitigate those costs by artificial intelligence, robotics, and things like that. And we as a country, and I know the private sector, through KEPSA, the private sector roundtables that we've had with the president, we've actually talked about this one word called competitiveness.
Sure.
And in competitiveness, we've actually defined what constitutes to competitiveness. And there are only 5 items that are involved in a cost sheet. Whoa. Any product that you make. One is your bill of materials, which largely all of us are buying at world price. So I don't think we have any disadvantage with any country in the world when you talk about your bill of materials.
Yeah.
The disadvantages come in the other 4 pillars. And those pillars, one is logistics. Again, it's infrastructure, costs, utility. That's water, electricity.
Yeah.
The other one is finance and the cost of finance. I mean, it's shocking that we end up paying such high finance numbers in Africa, and yet if you look at the default rate of investment gone wrong in Africa, it's very little. There were more defaults in Russia, India, and China on big, large FDIs than there have ever been on the continent of Africa. But when you talk to the large finances, they price in something called country risk. They make you uncompetitive.
Sure.
And the last one is, of course, productivity in terms of labor. We, as Kenya government, through the presidential roundtable, are addressing those 4 areas. And very soon you'll start seeing we'll unpackage each and every one of them and make you competitive so that you can compete.
Yeah. Rachel, I would like you to connect with the young lady here about the issue that she raised and your structures in terms of helping her, because in the interest of our time, we're running out of time.
Okay.
I want to take another last round of questions very quickly.
Just a quick one, because Ernest has raised a very important point. Kenya does not have, Kenya is a solid partner with China. Similar countries are Nigeria and Tanzania. South Africa has a strategic plan as to how it relates with China. Kenya needs to have a strategic plan with how it relates to China. I would be curious to understand what percentage of the inputs for the standard gauge rail were made in Kenya. You know, we need to have a plan as to how we interface and build a business. Dorothy, something that surprised me when I was looking at the SME space is we tend to copy and replicate in Kenya. So for example, Kisumu County is a net importer of food. Your Java truck takes food from Nairobi every single morning to Kisumu because it can't meet the market. We don't converse. We don't have a conversation as to what it is that we want to do.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry to cut you off because
okay.
we do need to take the last round of questions, but I think you raised an important point. I was going to add that perhaps what we require as Africa is a China strategy as Africa.
Yeah.
Because here we are, we're building this block, and yet we're going individual and trying to do deals with a how many $1 trillion economy?
I look at China as an opportunity, not as a threat. In fact, China is hosting the first IMPO on the 5th of November this year. Never in the history have we seen expos where you go and present your goods and call them that we are exporting and these are what we are good for.
Sure.
On the 5th of November to the 11th of November, China has opened their doors to all African countries. Come showcase your products to us. So we have an
something on SMEs. Just very briefly.
Very briefly.
Yeah, on SMEs, I think the Chamber of Commerce actually is the go-to organization for SMEs.
Right.
And for us, we're very clear what SMEs need and actually to play a bigger role in economic activity. One is they need a stable legal and regulatory environment. 2, they need access to capital. And 3, they need an environment where they can trade without being shackled with the multiple licenses like we're seeing in many countries.
Sure.
And an upskilling, which I think is happening in this country.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
okay.
just sorry,
I'll check
because she did ask about, you know, how they get the trade fair and things like that. There's going to be a trade, the digital portal included in the trade fair, so they don't have to be physically there as SMEs because they may, but they can participate through that portal basically.
Absolutely. I was also going to add that in Ivory Coast, actually, the government is facilitating participation by private sector players. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Okay. Let's take just a couple of questions left. Where are the microphones? Guys, where are the microphones? If you have a microphone, speak.
Thank you.
Okay.
My name is...
All right, let's take him quickly.
My name is Charles Osengo. I am from the Governing Council of the Kenya Institute of Planners.
Quickly, sir.
My contribution or question is looking at how we are financing infrastructure in Africa. We are approaching it at individualistic country level, which is likely to actually impair our development initiatives, particularly when we fail to repay some of the loans. It will definitely affect our trade we are speaking about. That is one element. Number two...
That's the last one.
Number two, we are looking at this professional area of planning. In Europe, we have had European spatial planning of the entire Europe. Why Africa are we still behind that we have not thought of planning the entire Africa? I'm thinking of an African spatial plan, a template that will help us really deliver this trade initiative you are speaking about.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And at this point, we have to say goodbye to our viewers on CNBC Africa. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you in Cairo in December. Asante sana. But our debate here continues, right? So let's take some more questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.